Hey Denchbags, what's going on? It's Landon Remixes here, and welcome to the grand finale, my top 10 albums of 2016. If you're wondering why this video went up so late, I currently have no power and therefore no internet, so there's no way for me to upload this video. I'm going to try to edit as much as I can before the power comes back on, so I can hopefully get that up as soon as I do have internet, but this might go out a bit later than I expected, maybe even in early 2017, so if that does happen, then I strongly apologize. 2016, though, was a little bit of a letdown year, so honestly picking out my 10 favorite albums from this year wasn't too difficult, and honestly you guys probably could have figured out the 10 that I was going to pick out from all the albums I've reviewed this year. And like I mentioned in my top 10 EPs of 2016 video, I had a much harder time figuring out my 10 favorites from those, just because I reviewed so many more EPs this year than I did albums, just because there weren't really that many albums to me that really stuck out. Aside from that, I actually have a slew of honorable mentions that I picked out for this video, just things that I picked out for various reasons, but mostly albums that I didn't review on my own, even albums that I feel like I couldn't even talk about in a rapid fire review just because I'm so far out of the vein of these genres that these albums are in. So my honorable mentions for 2016 go as follows: Wildflower by the Avalanches, I Like It When You Sleep for You Are So Beautiful Yet So Unaware of It by the 1975, 22 A Million by Bon Iver, Bottomless Pit by Death Grips, Ology by Gallant, and then the last two are going to be a little bit different. They are actually albums that I did review but didn't pick for this top 10 just for very small, minuscule reasons. I've got Untitled Unmastered by Kendrick Lamar, and the only reason why that didn't make my top 10 is because I'd feel really weird about putting a compilation album of sorts on my top 10 albums of the year. And Where Is Luna by Lone Moon, which I didn't put on my top 10 basically because it's a fairly short album and it filled up a lot of its space with remixes, so I would have felt really odd putting something like that on my top 10 overall albums, so it gets at least an honorable mention. Really enjoyable work though. All very solid albums, and I would definitely give my recommendation for each and every one of these albums. Definitely go check these out, especially if they're a little bit out of your vein. They definitely were out of mine and I enjoyed them quite a bit. But let's get into my regular top 10 albums of 2016. We're going to start off strong with my number 10, which is Wild Youth from Swedish House Mafia's very own Steve Angello. Half of this album was actually released in 2015, but it didn't come into a full body of work until early this year. And straight and simple, Steve Angello proved himself to be the most versatile artist from Swedish House Mafia, something that I didn't believe prior to this album's release. In 2016, I've lost a lot of faith in the melodic big room house movement, but Steve Angello seemed to ignite that a little bit more for myself, especially on Remember featuring the presets, one of the more beautiful ones I've heard in this genre in a really long time, with Steve Angello reflecting on his time in the Swedish House Mafia and how he feels abandoned and everything. Just a really powerful moment on this record, as well as the closer ... I would say there are a couple pretty weak moments on this album, like Prisoner featuring Gary Go, but honestly those moments seem to be pretty overpowered by the more powerful moments on this record, and something that I really enjoyed overall. My number 9 is going to be the sophomore collaborative album by Macklemore and Ryan Lewis called This Unruly Mess I've Made. It's like all the wackiness you'd come to expect from Macklemore given his previous hit singles like Thrift Shop off the Heist album, except Macklemore completely goes off the deep end, it seems, with This Unruly Mess I've Made in large part. And this comes into full swing on songs like Downtown, Let's Eat, and Brad Pitt's Cousin. Meanwhile, there's an entire other side of this album contrasting that with Macklemore's social justice side. On this side, Macklemore just speaks a lot of truth, and he hit me in a lot of places that I didn't know I could be hit in. I can definitely say that songs like Light Tunnels, Kevin, and White Privilege 2 definitely caught me off guard and really got me thinking about a lot of things that I didn't really think about prior to this album. Not to mention that Ryan Lewis seems to be on another level entirely with his production on this album, which I feel like has significantly improved since The Heist. And just like with Wild Youth, I definitely feel like there are a couple weak moments on this album, but for the most part, I think this is probably Macklemore's best work to date. This Unruly Mess I've Made gave me that rude awakening that I feel like I really needed, but has enough zaniness on it to keep me coming back over and over again. My number 8 is going to be Blink-182's newest, California. And I'll admit, I haven't seen myself come back to this album a whole lot in the winter, and I honestly think that's just because this album is meant to be a summer jam album. Just roll the windows down and crank these tunes on a hot summer day, and I feel like you'll have a lot of fun with it. Of course, there are a number of things missing from this album, notably former lead vocalist Tom DeLonge. But I feel like Alkaline Trio's Matt Skiba really takes the reins on this record, with some pretty awesome vocal performances on tracks like Left Alone. This also spawned a set of really great lyrics about Tom's departure on tracks like Cynical and No Future. There are a number of moments on this album that seem a little bit cheesy and silly for where Blink-182 should be in their maturity right now, but honestly I kind of need that pop-punk silliness in my life right now, considering pop-punk is all but dead at this point. But overall, honestly, I feel like this is some of Blink-182's best work to date. Definitely a really good follow-up to Neighborhoods, which was just fan-crushing. Some people might not have liked this album that much, notably my favorite music critic, Anthony Fantano, but I enjoyed it quite a bit myself. And hopefully this album won't simply be a comeback. Hopefully this isn't the end of Blink-182, because I definitely like to see them progress more from this point and maybe even take a higher slot on my list with their next album, whatever happens with it. My number 7 is going to go to Haywyre for Twofold Part 2. Twofold Part 1 made my top 10 albums of 2014 list, the first top 10 I ever did on my channel, so it's only fitting that Part 2 make the countdown this year. Man, now I can say Monster Cat does not usually do a great job of putting out LPs. I know it's not necessarily their problem to deal with, but rather it seems like their artists a lot of the time don't really know how to put a solid LP out, but I've got to say Haywyre always impresses with his bodies of work. And I can say it took me quite a long time to figure out what the concept of this album was, what Haywyre was trying to say with it. But it seems that Twofold Part 2 was really made to be the complete opposite of Twofold Part 1, which was supposed to sound a lot more organic. This thing sounds a lot more mechanical. He even goes as far as to reflect this in the album's artwork and the tracks' names following one after another, each track just being the opposite of the previous, and with Do You Don't You being the opposite of itself. And this idea is even reflected on in the lyrics of the track Restraint, which is pretty cool. Twofold Part 2 sees Haywyre exchanging his glitch hop style for more elements in house and future bass. Not only that, but this album seems to feature some of the more well thought out house music I've ever heard before. Again and again, Haywyre seems to be proving that he's Monster Cat's most talented artist, and I feel like he definitely did it with this album. As you guys might know, with my end of the year countdowns, December releases get thrown in with the following year, and of course the same will go with this year's releases. For December will end up in 2017's top 10 countdown. So of course, my number 6 is going to go to Troye Sivan with Blue Neighbourhood. Now both the regular and deluxe editions of this album were absolutely fantastic. I probably couldn't even pick a favorite from those two. This tiny Australian YouTube celebrity has an absolutely huge voice, and he has a lot to say in his lyrics as well. Unlike other albums on this list, I really can't pick on Blue Neighbourhood. There wasn't a single moment I can remember that I didn't love on this album. From its really soft ballads to its future bass bangers, this album is just all around really fun and youthful, no pun intended, all over the place. And like I already mentioned, with the deluxe version, there's 18 freaking tracks on this thing, and I couldn't remember a single spot where I was bored, even remotely on that version of the album. I also love that Sivan was able to do most of this album on his own without recruiting a ton of big name producers and big name pop voices to feature on this thing. In fact, most of the features on this are local Australian names, which made for just an experience of me finding a lot of new artists to look to, which most EDM pop albums don't seem to do these days. I can gladly say I absolutely cannot wait for Troye Sivan's next project. I'm really looking forward to it. Here we go with my top 5, and what better way to start it than with the debut album by Steven. This one is called Sincerely. Similarly to Eden, this guy is a rocker, a singer, and a producer all in one big package. And I mean, Steven really pulls out the big guns of competition with this album. I'm not kidding. Simply enough, Steven is just one of those artists that are really pushing EDM producers out of their comfort zone, like, what on earth do I do now? And really no big guests were needed to make this album a success either, because the only feature on the entire album is InQ, a poet who speaks a very short line on the first track of this album, and then there's no other features either in production or vocals on the rest of this thing. And I do think that simply enough, Sincerely will be the album to convert fans of classic rock to electronic music. That's how diverse this thing is all over the place. Aside from that, just a number of absolutely unforgettable tracks like Crossfire and the title track, Sincerely, which is easily my favorite on the record. With Sincerely, Sivan speaks to every bone of the eardrum, and I know I'm not going to have a problem coming back to this album for years and years to come. Number 4 is Skin by Flume. I can very clearly remember a distant time when I wasn't so much of a fan of Flume, but this album really turned me over. Talk about incorporating pop music into one's own unique sound. Flume absolutely slayed with Skin. I can say there are a number of pop and hip-hop artists keeping this album afloat, but you almost feel like Flume doesn't even need them because the instrumentals on this album are pretty catchy. I won't praise this album as much as I did in my initial review of it, just because I feel like with its 16 track length, this album got a little more drawn out with every passing listen this year, but I definitely feel like it's still worthy of recognition in this list. No matter what, I still think it's pretty killer and easily one of my favorites that 2016 has had to offer. On the other side of things, at my number 3 slot, we have Illenium with Ashes, which I listened to practically every day this year and never got sick of it. And talk about artists that completely come out of the blue. Illenium totally surprised me with this debut album. And I can't say that Ashes is the most complex album in the world, because it definitely isn't. It's probably not even more complex than Flume's Skin album was. But there's something about this combination of pop, rock, indie-tronic, and liquid dubstep that just evokes nothing but beauty to me. And once again, Ashes is one of those albums that just doesn't need a big handful of well-known pop vocalists and producers. He did most of this thing on his own. In fact, there's a different guest on practically every single track on this album, and I had only heard of 3 of them prior to this album's release, and that's Sound Remedy, Eden, who's not even technically credited on the album, and Echoes. The rest of them, I had no clue who they were prior to this album's release. A lot of these, though, I feel like are names that I'm not going to forget for a long time, like Liam O'Donnell or Quinn92. Joni Fatora, Nina Sung, just absolutely beautiful. But what could be better than Ashes, you might ask? Well, let's look at my favorite 2. Starting off with The Human Condition by Jon Bellion. Talk about an artist who really changed my opinion of them. Jon Bellion is a prime example of that. My first experience with Jon Bellion was Beautiful Now off of Zed's album, which you guys might know was my least favorite track from that album, and then Jon Bellion started putting out singles for this, and I was nonetheless impressed. The Human Condition is the kind of experimentation that the pop world needs right now, and I'm very happy to see All Time Low on the radio because of that. It's truly reversing that formula that pop and dance music have set in the last few years. While breaking the mold with these well-thought-out lyrics and unique production, The Human Condition is catchy enough to keep me coming back throughout the year, and I'm sure for years to come. My picks with He Is the Same probably prevented me from putting this album on my number 1 slot this year, but regardless, I still love this album. And for my number 1, my favorite album of 2016, my regular viewers actually should have seen this one coming because this is the only album that I've given a 9.5 in the entire year. This is Everything by Lido. I actually had my expectations really high for this album, and Lido still managed to surpass those. I can't even begin to explain the concepts and the complex production on this album, so I definitely just say you need to check out this album for yourself if you haven't yet. Probably the craziest thing about Everything is that this album is literally a love story about Lido and Halsey, and then Halsey is featured as a featured artist many times on this album. It's just crazy, absolutely crazy, and if you haven't listened to this album yet, just get out of my face. And that's about it for my top 10 albums of 2016. If you guessed my number 1, great. You are a smart cookie. Besides that, I have the Spotify links to those albums in the description, as well as the original reviews if you guys want to check those out. And in the comment section below, let me know what your absolute favorite album of this year was, because I definitely want to hear it. Anyway, I'm Landon Remixes. I'll see you guys early in 2017, given that this video itself isn't coming out in early 2017. And I'll see you guys later. Peace.